On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 a.m. Berlin time, German border guards called the Russian border guards to the bridge over the Bug River near Kolodno to discuss something important. When the Russians approached, the Germans mowed them down with machine guns, thus initiating Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history. Over 4 million Axis soldiers advanced into the Soviet Union along a front nearly 1,500 kilometers long, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, progressing at a remarkable speed. After 3 months, the Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, but the failure of Operation Typhoon in early December marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. Despite catastrophic losses, the USSR somehow managed to defend itself that winter of 1941 and then launched a counteroffensive. This operation opened the bloodiest front of World War II, the so-called Eastern Front. After swift victories in the West and the intense bombing of Britain, Hitler turned to the realization of his greatest dream, to push back the borders of the Slavic world and create a new empire in the East. The plan envisaged creating Lebensraum, or living space, by cleansing the territories of the savages in the East. Millions of young Germans had been convinced since childhood that the Soviet Union threatened their nation's survival. The Führer was extremely confident, deciding to ignore Bismarck's warning that Russia should not be attacked if there was a risk of a two-front war. He justified his long-standing desire to crush Jewish Bolshevism by claiming it would be the most certain way to force Great Britain into an agreement. His arrogance was evident in underestimating the level of military and industrial development that Stalin had already achieved, in his casual disregard for Russia's almost boundless expanse, and in the woefully inadequate logistical support for a long war. After the victory in the West, it never crossed his mind that it might be far more challenging to defeat a society accustomed to harshness and suffering. Although a significant part of the Wehrmacht's high command was against a war in the East, with a few exceptions, everyone believed that the USSR was a backward state with an army devastated by Stalin's purges. As part of the plan to dissuade Hitler from war, the German military attaché in Moscow was allowed to visit some huge weapons factories being built in Siberia. However, his report had the opposite effect of what was intended. To the general's astonishment, the Third Reich's leader said, "Do you see how far they have come? We must strike immediately." On the eve of the German invasion, the Soviet Union was a society with the strictest regulations and the strongest police oversight in the world. Its mechanism of domestic repression was highly developed, and by 1941 had killed more people than Nazism. Stalin's purges had decimated the command cadre and slowed the modernization of the Red Army. All this was well known to the Nazi intelligence service. In addition, the Red Army units in the western part of the country were poorly deployed to avoid provoking the Nazis. German preparations for aggression against the USSR began in the summer of 1940. On July 21st, Field Marshal Brauchitsch, commander of the ground forces, was tasked with studying the problems of waging war in the East. On July 31st, Hitler announced to the military leadership that the decision was final. The basic idea of the plan was to defeat Soviet forces west of Moscow and to occupy the territory of the USSR up to the line Rostov-Gorky-Arkhangelsk. To achieve these goals, the main forces were to operate through Minsk and Smolensk towards Moscow, while weaker forces were to advance south towards Kiev and north towards Leningrad. The execution deadline was set at 9 weeks, or a maximum of 17. After necessary modifications and additions, the Führer signed Directive Number 21 on December 18th. The operational plan was codenamed Barbarossa, named after the German king and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The directive also stated that assistance from Romania and Finland could be expected. On March 13, 1941, the directive was supplemented with regulations on the organization of political administration in the occupied areas. This task was entrusted to Himmler and his Einsatzgruppen. An unexpected event in Yugoslavia on March 27th delayed the attack for 4 weeks. The final date was set for April 30th and was to be June 22nd. For the aggression, 152 divisions were prepared: 104 infantry, 19 armored, 10 motorized, 4 SS motorized, 1 cavalry, 1 SS police, 4 mountain, and 9 for security. They had 50,000 artillery pieces, 3,500 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, 625,000 horses, and 500,000 motor vehicles. Additionally, the Finns and Romanians contributed another 29 well-equipped divisions. The forces were divided into 3 army groups: North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb; Center, commanded by Field Marshal Feder von Bock; and South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. As for the USSR, while the Nazis were rampaging through Western Europe, Stalin was not idle. Strategic conditions for defense were improved by moving the border westward. Since the beginning of the war, in 1939, the NKVD had reduced its activities, allowing industry to work at full capacity. Defense expenditures before 1939 accounted for 13% of the total budget, increasing to nearly 27% at the start of the war. Many military factories were opened in the Far East. Special emphasis was placed on designing new tanks, the medium T-34 and the heavy KV, which were superior to Nazi tanks. Most Soviet weaponry was equal to or even better than German equipment, though their anti-tank and anti-aircraft artillery were lacking. Nevertheless, the Red Army was in the process of reorganizing in 1941, so the war came too early for it. A significant flaw was the insufficient supply of communication means. For transportation, the USSR relied on railways, which slowed modernization. But manpower was not lacking. In addition to 4 million active soldiers, the Army had another 15 million in reserve. For border protection, there were 10 armies on the front, but the organization of defense lines was incomplete, and the built structures were not well camouflaged. On the eve of the attack, Soviet forces in the border regions were grouped into 5 military districts: Leningrad, Baltic, Western, Kiev, and Odessa. The fleet was divided into the Northern, Baltic, and Black Sea fleets. Given the scale of the reorganization initiated in 1939, many believed that Stalin was considering attacking the Nazis first when they were exhausted in the West, but the unexpectedly quick defeat of France put him in an unfavorable position. The Red Army soldiers were completely unprepared to deal with the experienced Wehrmacht.